Hello, my name is Marjory Hooper. My grandfather and grandmother first came to Grand Lake in the 1880s. They married in 1883 in Denver and moved to San Antonio at the late 1880s. They moved to San Antonio because my grandfather was afraid of tuberculosis. It was in his family, and it was a dry climate down there, but they came to Grand Lake every summer for 3 months. They left San Antonio after school was out and went back after Labor Day. I don't know, they lived in Denver a few years after they were married. Their oldest son, Carlton, was born in Denver. And then a few years later they had a son, Craig, and then they had a son, Jay Jr. And my mother was born when these boys were all older. Carlton was 19 and Craig was maybe 17 and Jay was 14. And they brought my mother up here. She was born in June of 1905, and she came up at the age of 1 month. And they used to come from San Antonio by train to Denver, and they'd stay in Denver a while, and then they would come over the pass by a horse-drawn buggy, and they'd have to get out of the buggy because the horses were so hard to pull up the hill, and the horses even wore their hoofs completely off, and they had to change horses. And then later on they came in the Model Ts with the first cars up from Denver, and then at that time they'd have to get out and still walk up the pass in the car to get the car to come up. And they'd bring help with them from San Antonio, servants, and they would stop in Granby and pick up a horse and a cow that they'd left there and buy a bunch of chickens, and they would go over, I think they would stay in town at the Kaufman house and then go across the lake by rowboat or walk around the next day. And they were completely isolated over there. The tunnel road wasn't built until maybe the 40s, and so they had to walk all the way around. And they had rowboat. They'd row to town and get the mail. My mother would row and often not get back till after dark, and they'd come into the Fitzgeralds, which is the Hall House now, that my grandfather's business partner. And my grandfather had great plans for development. Bought all the property up to the East Inlet on up to the falls, and had a plat drawn of all the lots, and was going to have a big development there. And then he died in 1922. I didn't know my grandfather. And then my mother and I used to come. Oh, and then in 1933, I was born in 1932. 1933, my brother, who was 5, was drowned. And a couple of years after that, my parents divorced. And then years later, Mother married Lauren Benton. And then Mother and I would bring my grandmother up in July, and then we'd stay for 2 weeks, and and then the rest of the older brothers would come with their families, their wives and their children, and they did a lot of fishing, and the whole family. My grandfather used to have all the boys work. They chopped wood and built little gazebos around on the hilltops, kept everybody working, and every morning they had to have Bible reading and breakfast. I believe at 7:30, the whole family, and the maids they had iron tablecloths and iron napkins, which the irons had been heated on the wood stove, And my grandmother always helped in the kitchen too with the cooking, and then they helped chop wood. And Mother was always amazed how my grandmother brought her children up here without any access to any medical help or anything, and they always got along just fine. And then they'd go back to San Antonio in the winter. And then and then my grandmother died in 1953, and Craig and Mildred, Craig was the middle, Adam's son, bought the house from the estate and all the properties, I believe, on up whole East Inlet on up. And then when Craig died in 1968, Bert, my husband, bought the place, and that was just for the house. The East Inlet Association bought all the property up there. And you think, what else do you think?